Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar today. We are fortunate to be joined by Dr. Laura Swoboda for today's presentation on Who Gives a Sheet, talking about linen optimization in acute care settings. Before we get started, just to give everyone a few more seconds to get logged on and everything, I'm wondering if you can just pop into the chat where you're joining us from, whether that's state, country, whatever works for you is perfect for me. I'm just going to open the chat here. We've got people from Michigan, Ottawa, Montreal, Tennessee, Utah, Texas, Maryland. Oh my gosh, it's going so fast. Washington, California, Barcelona, Illinois. So we've got people from all over joining, which is amazing. I always love this. This is probably one of the greatest parts of my job, is being able to bring education to such a diverse group of people from across a wide variety of locations. My next question is going to be, what is your clinical background? So are you a nurse? Are you an LPN? Are you a nurse practitioner? Are you part of our allied health team? Physician, seeing lots of nurses, PTs, WOCNs. Amazing. Informatics, managers. Fantastic. I love this. CNS, great. Okay, and then my next question will be, what clinical setting do you work in? Are you in acute care, long-term care, or skilled nursing facility? Are you doing home care? Lots of acute care. Amazing. Okay, this is fantastic. Everyone can keep adding their comments to the chat. I love this. Part of my job with Baxter is this opportunity to bring people together for educational opportunities. So I'm really pleased that you could all take time out of your busy day to join us, whether you're joining from the East Coast, the West Coast, or further beyond, like one person from Spain that I noticed. We welcome you. We are also recording this presentation, so the recording will be available for everyone to access after today's presentation. And without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Laura Swoboda. She is a translational scientist, a family nurse practitioner, practicing wound specialist in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And in addition to providing direct patient care, Dr. Swoboda serves as a principal investigator for quality improvement, evidence-based practice, and research projects in complex wound care. They serve on the board of directors for the Wound, Ostomy, and Continence Nursing Certification Board and the Association for the Advancement of Wound Care. They also participate on the National Pressure Injury Advisory Panel's Prophylactic Dressing Standards Initiative Task Force, that's a mouthful, and the American Heart Association's Peripheral Arterial Disease National Action Plan. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass the presentation over to Dr. Laura Swoboda, and I will ask that anyone with a question box, and at the very end of the presentation, we'll address all questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining. I know we had, I saw some Canadians, we have the US, we have Europe represented, so a really great group. And we're all here today to talk about who gives a sheet about linen optimization. And clearly all of us do, right? So our objectives are to discuss patient care interventions that utilize linen and absorptive products between the patient and their support surface, to describe the dermal microclimate and its effect on pressure injury risk. And then we're going to list some evidence-based interventions to optimize the effectiveness of those support surfaces. And we'll begin by going over the kind of data on pressure injuries. Just as a reminder, I know a lot of you are experts on this. Pressure injuries are tissue breakdown due to sustained deformations caused by pressure but exacerbated by environmental conditions. And those can be mitigated through suitable materials to disperse that surface and internal tissue stresses. So we know that, this is a nursing care quality indicator, and we can mitigate some of that risk for developing these. The morbidity of pressure injury, so that clinical impact of it. The prevalence and incidence of pressure injuries varies by setting, and unfortunately, it hasn't changed very much in 20 years. The cost of care has escalated. We have a lot more interventions, but we have, a very similar prevalence and incidence. We have 1 to 3 million people in the US, 7 million worldwide with pressure injuries. And when we look at the different settings, so acute care, it depends on the location, the incidence and prevalence can vary quite a bit. Med surge 5 to 15%, which is quite high of people in that setting. Long-term acute care, even higher. Rehab environment still, I think, quite high, 12%. Nursing homes, almost 12% as well. And in our community as well, a significant impact. 70.6% of the patients admitted to hospital with a pressure injury were living at home before entering acute care hospital. So a lot of these pressure injuries are developing in that home setting. And I think a lot of what we're talking about today can cross over into that setting. And when we're looking at reform of our healthcare systems and making sure that people can access the tools that they need, we need to be considering that environment as well. 21.4% were receiving home care services prior to admission. So these people already had contact with the healthcare services and still, had these pressure injuries. So we need to make sure, again, that tools are accessible across the care environments. Pressure injuries are associated, and these are just US statistics, so with 60,000 deaths annually, which is huge. A lot of people don't consider that, but that, a lot of times this will eventually lead to death or contribute to it. For every 1,000 pressure injuries, there are 41 excess deaths. And this, of course, especially in the US, where we have a privatized healthcare system, but really anywhere, it leads to a lot of lawsuits. It's a nursing care quality indicator, so it's affecting reimbursement. It's the second most common claim after wrongful death. There are 17,000 lawsuits annually, and these are extremely expensive. It's a whole separate industry. They are doing these lawsuits based on the development of pressure injuries as well as the care of pressure injuries. So certainly something that's heavily litigated and contributes to the excessive costs that we see. So this is a high cost for both the patient and for the healthcare system, and really leads to decreased quality of life. Having a wound of any kind is it's a hassle. It's something you're always worried about. And having a pressure injury when you're needing to offload that area, even if you recover and correct everything that led to it, it's still something that's going to significantly impact your quality of life going forward. So keeping all of that in mind, it's still important to know that the costliest intervention is actually you. It's the healthcare provider, and that's due to just the time associated with repositioning, with the extended needs of these patients, their incontinence cares, etc. With the obesity, the rise of obesity, we know that there are more staff injuries. We need more time, more staff to reposition these people. It takes, sometimes 4 or 6 staff members to reposition people. So we want to make sure that we're optimizing our interventions, right? So that we're bundling our care, so that we're, working smarter, not harder, and that we're working safely and we're not getting injured. There have been declines in hospital-acquired conditions, other hospital-acquired conditions. This is from the US, from the AHRQ, but not for pressure injuries, right? So that's actually increased. And that's led to an additional almost 120,000 pressure injuries, approximately 1 million $1,726,200,000. Just huge, huge costs. It's like now that it's in the billions, everything, right? We've almost lost the context of how extraordinary the amount of money that goes into this is. And like we talked about before, an additional 4,880 deaths just associated with the increase in the hospital-acquired condition. Where do pressure injuries tend to occur? So we know the sacrum and the heel are always reported as, you know, two of the most common sites. We also see them quite a bit. Any bony prominence are under medical devices, right? So depending on patient positioning, which tended to be supine most commonly in acute care. However, with COVID, you know, we had an increased use of prone positioning, and we started to see all these other bony prominences affected. But still, the greater trochanter, ischial tuberosities, the lateral malleoli and the sides of the feet, I actually see quite a bit, especially in the rehab environment, when people are left for long periods of time and their feet pronate outwards, and then beneath a medical device. Tissue. So why are we developing at that site? And it's interesting, those bony prominences, you know, some are more affected than others. Is it the degree that the prominence sticks out? And that's part of it. There's actually a PhD in, I believe, England, and she only studies the heel. And it's because of this like unique tissue, the forces and how they're exerted there, the subcutaneous tissues, the tendons and ligaments and things that are attaching there, and it's really unique in the forces. And so we're going to have altered tissue tolerance based on where it is in the body, but also based on the patient itself. So when we talk about tissue tolerance, we talk about the ability of skin, its supporting structures to endure pressure without adverse sequelae. So can your skin hold up to the forces that it's enduring? And here's my extremely professional squiggly line drawings of our blood vessels in our skin and subcutaneous tissue. And I just wanted to illustrate, you know, how we're getting our blood supply from our, through our connective tissue, from our muscle, you know, our bone, through the hypodermis, the subcutaneous tissue, into the dermis, and how friction and shear can impact that. So when you think about shear, if you're lounging in a chair and you're pulling yourself down, and that skin layer is sliding against the other layers, the deeper layers of your body, you're kinking off those blood vessels. So you're getting, you know, some local ischemia, and you may get some collateral perfusion from other areas, but it's going to be decreased. And in a sick patient, they're going to have less of an ability to have that collateral blood flow. In addition, shear is causing that cellular deformation that we know is another contributing factor to pressure injuries. So just the cells themselves, when they get squeezed and pushed, sometimes a little bit of force like that is good and it encourages them to heal. But when it's prolonged or severe, we get that cytoskeletal deformation, and that leads to cellular necrosis. And it's kind of a positive feedback loop, right? Because when one cell dies from necrosis, it doesn't package itself up into nice little bubbles of useful supplies like it does with apoptosis. It's just necrotic. It's just all their inflammatory contents just poof out and irritating everybody else around them. So then all the other ones are more inflamed, more susceptible to the shear forces, to cellular deformation, etc. Positive feedback loop of destruction, tissue destruction, and the development ultimately of a pressure injury. As opposed to friction, which we also get the cellular deformation, but also that's more, you know, at skin level. And we're thinking more about the brick and mortar structure of our skin and its ability to shift and disperse those shear forces. So both are very, very important factors in the development of pressure injuries. And I briefly mentioned COVID, and there's, you know, many other conditions, obviously, that put us in a critical care situation. But critical illness significantly impacts tissue tolerance for a number of reasons. With COVID-19, it will directly impair the inner lining of the blood vessels. but really any kind of critical illness is going to disturb sometimes the moisture content. If you have fever, if you have incontinence, you're diaphoretic, you have an excess of medical devices, you're tubed in like every orifice, right? So you're going to have increased risk just because of the amount of medical devices. You tend to have lower oxygenation, and you have alternative and poor positioning. You're weak, a lot of times you're prone. So there's a lot of factors that are affecting the tissue tolerance of these patients, making them more likely to get a pressure injury. Now, this is a photo of actually somebody with a COVID-19 skin lesion. So this is a tissue ischemia directly from the critical illness and the COVID-19. But we can see they also have a pressure injury over that gluteal prominence. And we have a couple days left in June. It's still Pride Month, so I always say, why not both? It is COVID-19. It's also a pressure injury. In this case, we know it's primarily that COVID-19 just because we see it not on the prominences, the tissue prominences, that type of a thing. It's important to differentiate when we're tracking, because it is a nursing care quality indicator to distinguish between them. Looking at our pressure injury statistics, patients admitted to the ICU with pressure injury have a higher mortality risk. Pressure injuries are one of the most frequent occurring yet preventable complications in the hospital. So it's something we can do something about, right? And it's so challenging now with staffing shortages. Even if you're going to do a new intervention, a new product, what have you, educating people on it, it's just so challenging. It just keeps getting harder and harder, I feel. But we do know that linens and dressings are used to prevent and manage pressure injuries. So there's something that we can do, something we can focus our attention to that there's a lot of research on, and we'll talk about that. Therapeutic surfaces are used for pressure injury prevention and their treatment. And compared to foam surfaces, so just looking at some of the research on them, reactive air surfaces may reduce pressure ulcer risk and may increase complete ulcer healing. So when we're looking at prevention and treatment, compared with foam surfaces, reactive gel surfaces may reduce pressure injury risk, especially in the OR and long-term care settings. And it's still kind of question mark when we're looking at meta-analyses and things, reactive air versus alternating pressure air surfaces. So hospital mattresses and specialty support surfaces offload pressure, but the number and type of additional linen layers between the patient and the support surface affect their efficacy. And that really sums up what we're here to talk about today. So we know that these specialty support surfaces offload pressure, but how we use them is going to determine, how effective they can be. There's a lot of technology, a lot of research used to design these therapeutic support surfaces. And we want to make sure that we're using them effectively. We place linens under patients for a lot of reasons, right? For moisture management, when they're super diaphoretic, and for other reasons, incontinence containment is the most common, and repositioning of immobile patients. So sometimes we have that draw sheet, that flat sheet that people are using to reposition patients. So there's a lot of different types of linens and a lot of different reasons that we're using them under patients. And we use a lot of different kinds of products. There's quilted fabric, which is, environmentally sustainable. We can wash it and use it. So there's benefits and there's detriments to each one of these. There are paper-backed products, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. There are also ones with plastic elements. So this is what I have at home. I have it, for my cat. I have puppy pads, with plastic backing. And it's nice because it doesn't get through that plastic backing, the moisture. When I remove it, it removes, all of that moisture with it. But I'm using that against my basement floor. You know what I mean? I'm using it against concrete. It's nice and cool down there. I'm not using it against, somebody's skin and a human body that's very warm. The subtypes of layers between the patient and the support surface impacts the skin microclimate. So it's not just the number of layers, it's the type of layer as well that is going to impact the skin microclimate. What is the microclimate? The dermal microclimate is defined as where the patient's skin contacts the support surface. So what is that microclimate at that interaction between the therapeutic support surface and the patient's skin? Microclimate, just in general as a term, is an environmental microclimate. It's that local set of atmospheric conditions that will differ from surrounding areas. So if you think about, where you're living, and we're all from very diverse settings right now, which is super cool. I'm in Wisconsin. We don't have a lot of mountains here. We don't have any mountains. We have bluffs and things though. So having a bluff, as the weather comes around it, or a mountain, it's going to be different at that contact than, over on the other side of it versus a river valley. They're going to have very subtle differences. And that's the microclimate of that situation. And just like our environmental microclimate, the skin has microclimates. And I like to think of this in terms of, maybe you've seen the now old movie Armageddon, where Ben Affleck has this little like animal cracker cookie, and he's like playing with it on Liv Tyler, and he's like talking about, the curves of her body or whatever, what have you. So I think about that as the skin microclimate in comparative to the environmental microclimate, right? So our intergluteal cleft is going to have a very different set of conditions than our feet will, than our axilla do, than our umbilicus does. And it affects our microbiome, it affects the brick and mortar structure of our skin. So this is very important in terms of the skin and its ability to interact with the external environment. The factors that make up the skin microclimate: the temperature, the moisture and humidity, and humidity, and also air movement. So all of these things, just like the environmental microclimate, are going to impact the skin microclimate. So that heat plus moisture, when we look at the moisture vapor transmission rate, we don't just study that. A lot of us hear that in terms of wound dressings, right? So we're absorbing wound drainage, and how much of it is stored in the dressing versus how much can that dressing kind of poof off and let that moisture through, and so it can actually absorb more because it's had a lot of the moisture go through the dressing. The same thing happens in our skin. So we'll look at our skin and its ability to hold in moisture and to release moisture, get a moisture balance in healthy skin, and the various conditions that will impact the moisture vapor transmission rate of our skin. Our skin maintains our microenvironment, it balances our moisture, it holds all of our human fluids in, but it needs to maintain that brick and mortar structure and its pH to be able to do that. And it's affected by a lot of different things. In clinical practice, the things that we see that are really going to impact that heat and moisture are our sweat. And in research, it's really interesting when we're talking about human sweat. And as well as like incontinence, human urine, it has, a very specific pH. It's not just water. There's a lot of different contents in that are going to impact the skin differently than if it was just, being exposed to just complete, normal saline or water. And then wound drainage as well, which we know is just really, really full of inflammatory contents, inflammatory cytokines, those types of things, as well as the human body's temperature itself. So if we're febrile and we're just hot at baseline, is going to change the microclimate environment, as well as our external environment, right? When we're talking about heat waves and things, I know a lot of us are going through that right now in the Northern Hemisphere. So when we're having a really hot and or moist external environment, and then we're also very sick, and how much that can affect our microclimate, our tissue tolerance, and our ability to withstand those forces without developing pressure injuries. So the brick and mortar structure of our skin, we have our corneocytes, right? Those are the bricks. And then we have these intercellular lipids, and that's what can really break down, especially depending on the pH and exposure to moisture. And we want to keep this intact. It's just like this. It is a brick wall protecting our internal environment from our external forces. We're maintaining fluid balance, all those things that our skin does. It holds our human fluids in, it maintains our fluid balance, it keeps us warm, it does all of those, it protects us from our microbiome infiltrating our internal environment. So our stratum corneum is that layer of corneocytes, and temperature will increase the water permeability of the stratum corneum. So when it's exposed to higher temperatures, it doesn't have that fluid balance as much, which means that we're going to have increased transepidermal water loss, and that means the cohesive strength of the skin is reduced. And when we're looking at newer technology to assess pressure injury development, especially across skin tones and things, we're really looking at that subepidermal moisture content, including the transepidermal water loss. So that's a very promising new technology in screening, especially for early pressure injuries and across skin tones. When the stratum corneum is overhydrated, we get changes in the mechanical properties of the skin. So when we were talking about my beautiful drawing of the capillaries and that perfusion status, the cellular deformation, and our skin's ability to disperse those different forces, when it's overhydrated, it can't do that. It decreases the resilience of the epidermal layer, and we ultimately will have increased susceptibility to both shear and friction. Increased moisture softens and weakens the stratum corneum. And again, we have these different moisture sources. We have perspiration, so we have human sweat if you're diaphoretic, urine. Sometimes we have fecal sources, which are full of even more inflammatory contents and heavily full of microbes. And then wound exudate, which is super irritating as well. And that's going to affect the coefficient of friction. So the coefficient of friction, and I like to think of it as, this penny experiment, which I know a lot of us have probably done in some way in a elementary or high school science class. And you put the water on the penny and you can see the surface tension of the water. It's not just when it reaches the edge of the penny, it stays, it starts running off right away. Water has this surface tension to it. And it can actually hold more, and it bubbles up and it can hold more water just because of the coefficient of friction, the forces within itself. And the same thing is going to happen when you have water against your skin. So the coefficient of friction is the measure of the amount of friction between two surfaces. And whether it's the skin and a therapeutic support surface or a penny and the water, but moisture is going to impact the skin's ability to transfer those friction forces. So when we're having friction, instead of, a wider surface area, the skin transferring those forces amongst itself and not getting as much deformation, we're going to have more of an impact directly to the skin when it's moist. So I always think about this when you're sticking to a leather chair in the heat. And here we have our swamp here. That's the not professional way of referring to this condition. But sticking to a leather chair, if you raise up too quickly, it's going to hurt. You're getting a lot of friction forces holding you to that chair as opposed to, slowly moving, because when you're moist, you're having that increased coefficient of friction. So looking at some of the research on this was from Springle in 2021, and I think this is a really cool study for a couple of reasons. This looked at prophylactic dressings commonly used for pressure injury prevention, and we don't totally understand the mechanism of them, the hypothesis being that friction between the dressing and the linen is really key And it's dispersing those forces. It's also providing tissue support, so we're not getting that shear and that blood vessel and cellular deformation there. What Springle did was test prophylactic dressings under more normal conditions than what they had been tested under previously. So we're looking at like 30 to 60 millimeters of mercury of pressure, which is more like about what it takes to close off capillaries, right? And under a human body against a support surface. They looked at wet skin, they looked at linens, they looked with and without dressings, and they looked at various linen types, so both linen and knitted. And they tested various dressings while in contact with that bed linen. All dressing coefficients of friction were lower than moist skin against linen. So we're looking at, the impact of that moist skin against a linen surface and how, in this case, prophylactic dressings were able to address that, but that we really want to maintain the microclimate. This study was cool because, and why I think Springle is cool, it has open access data. Complete open access data. So if you want to look through and review that, you can. Epidermal hydration on friction of skin against textiles. So this was a study by Gerhardt, and they looked at cotton poly sheet against a simulated skin and forearm skin, and kinetic coefficient of friction, which is the coefficient of friction with movement, increased 46%, so like a lot, when it was moist. So it's again showing those forces and how moisture really impacts the interaction between linen layers and skin. And ultimately, we know that that leads to risk of pressure injury. This was another study by, I'm sorry, Bernatchez. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly. But this was on epidermal hydration on friction of skin against textiles, and the coefficient of friction of hydrated skin was over twice the value found for dry skin. And this study was particularly looking at a liquid barrier film, which we use a lot, in protecting peri-wound skin, but also now for incontinence, dermatitis prevention, and now we're looking at it for pressure injury prevention, right? So they were looking at this liquid barrier film and the coefficient of friction, its ability to prevent that hydrated skin. So if you're using that, that it's going to prevent it to a greater extent than a silicone dressing, which was really interesting. So noteworthy are that interventions need to continue to effectively reduce loads over time, even when they're exposed to a changing environment. So our patients aren't just, and that's why we have to do, multiple, whatever your risk assessment is for pressure injuries, whether it's a Braden or Norton or whatever you're using. We don't just do it once in the acute care environment. We usually do it, every shift, or we have to do it daily in other environments. Or whatever the patient's risk may be, we increase that frequency because their status is changing. And so our treatments, our preventative treatments, our treatments, to prevent the worsening of pressure injuries need to be able to be dynamic and to continue to work in a changing environment. So when the patient is incontinent, diaphoretic, when they're subject to repetitive friction and shear, people are always going to be kind of moving against gravity down in their bed, right? You walk in and they're like, how'd you get that way? It's just like slowly over time, whoop, put them up. So that's going to be a chronic exposure. Some people have pain in their extremities and they're moving their legs, or they have restless leg from neuropathy or from peripheral arterial disease, and they're moving their feet a lot, and they're getting just repetitive friction to that brick and mortar structure, and especially of their heels. So we need to make sure that whatever we're doing is going to continue to work over time. The measurement of moisture trapped next to the skin, moisture escaped from the dressing, and heat trapped by the dressings show that some interventions are more suited to skin protection. So we're starting this whole research, now in just the last couple of decades, where we're not just looking at at not intact skin, that we're looking at prophylaxis. Microclimate impacts the skin and its supporting structures. It makes the skin, if it's adverse microclimate, so if it's hotter, if it's more moist, etc., the skin is less able to endure pressure, friction, and shear. So all of those forces that are leading to pressure injuries. An altered microclimate decreases that cutaneous resistance. So we're talking about our tissue tolerance, right? And a suboptimal microclimate frequently precipitates early forms of pressure injury onset. Some of the skin microclimate factors that impact our pressure injury risk are our moisture content, our humidity, the temperature, and the air movement of our microclimate. And when we're talking about therapeutic support surfaces, that's one that we're thinking about a lot, right? Now, the skin microclimate, and the reason we're all here, right, listening, is that the skin microclimate is considered a collection of modifiable risk factors for pressure injury prevention. So this is something that we can actually do something about. And we're going to talk about how linen layers directly contribute to that. Therapeutic support surfaces are designed to best offload and control the dermal microclimate with certain linen layers in use with that support surface. And that's because they're going to work better in terms of evaporative cooling and heat dissipation. So if we're using, blowing air from a support surface, it's going to cool the skin because you get that evaporative cooling. And we use this in all sorts of things, right? Think about a nuclear power plant. I mean, in a lot of them, that's how they're cooling those reactors, is that they have just tons of water that's cooling, dissipating the heat from that. And the same thing is what we're doing when we're blowing air against the skin. So we're cooling it, and we're also removing the moisture, that decreasing that coefficient of friction. So through evaporation and conduction of heat throughout the surface, the therapeutic surface. Now, certain types of layers prevent air from reaching the skin, and they can actually trap the heat and the moisture against the skin. And I like this slide. I think it really sums up all of the impact of linen layers on skin microclimate. So there's actually a lot of different ways that it does. One, it reduces the airflow, right? It's just a physical blockage, reducing that airflow. It also affects the pressure redistribution, so the ability of that therapeutic surface to actually distribute the pressure. We're going to increase that friction coefficient that we talked about, the sticking of your skin against it. And it can dry or macerate the skin. So we're impacting that brick and mortar structure of the skin and its ability to disperse friction forces and shear forces. And it also increased the skin temperature. So all of these things are different ways that linen layers will impact the skin microclimate. The layers between the patient have to be the correct type of layer and also the correct amount of layers. And this is really, when you're looking at intervening in this realm, what you're looking at. Now, this is a really high value, low cost intervention. Administration loves it because you're not generally, buying new things. You're like, there's a lot of new things you can do for pressure injury prevention, but they can be pretty high cost. So this is something where you're optimizing what you already have, that therapeutic support surface that's so effective, but you're not using it properly. So you're optimizing it. Now, when we're looking at linen type, so the NPIAP 2019 guidelines, they recommended the use of silk or silk-like sheets versus cotton or cotton blended sheets. Silk or silk-like linens have a lower coefficient of friction and quicker drying times. And this is why, they recommend them for silk pillows for your beauty rest. It's actually supposed to be good for your hair because that reduced coefficient of friction isn't causing the breakages, the split ends, making hair appear healthier, and then quicker drying time. So you're not getting that disrupted microbiome contributing to acne, dermatitis, those types of things. And so for the similar reasons, they're more effective linen type in the hospital setting. Now the linen number as well. So the linen number increases the mean peak sacral pressure compared to a single flat sheet. And this is evidence-based. This is from Williamson. And they looked at that mean peak sacral pressure of the linen numbers. Then they looked at transfer sheets, incontinence pads and combinations of linens. And that, the higher the number of linen that you're using, the increased mean peak sacral pressures. So obviously, if you're getting a higher pressure over your bony prominences because of the number of linen layers that you're using, you're going to have a higher pressure injury risk. And that increase of mean peak sacral pressure occurs on both low air loss surfaces and foam surfaces, and regardless of the head of bed angle. So you might say, oh, well, it's only when the head of bed is up or something, but no, they tested it at various head of bed angles as well. And they saw that, at any head of bed angle. And this was another study that confirmed this. This was an in vitro study by Fader et al. And they looked at the effect of interface pads against the gluteal and sacral areas of mannequins. But those mannequins had soft tissue-like qualities to them. And so they looked at this in the lab, and they took those mannequins and examined, had various pads underneath them and looked at the pressure from that soft tissue-like quality with the various pads underneath it. So linens and pads contribute to pressure injury development depending on how they affect microclimate factors, including the moisture amount. Moist incontinence pads. So this was a 2019 study. They exposed 12 subjects on pressure-loaded surfaces to moist incontinence pads and also dry incontinence pads. And they found that moist incontinence pads had increased transepidermal water loss. They had upregulated inflammatory markers. So when we talked about the necrosis, the cellular deformation, and cell death from necrosis and how that's a positive feedback loop, when you already have upregulated inflammatory markers, you're adding fuel to that positive feedback loop. And dry pads found no transepidermal water loss, so that those moist incontinence pads were especially effective in a negative way, right? And this was another study. This was a 2018 retrospective review by Kaiser, and they looked at the international pressure ulcer prevalence data. They had 216,000, over 216,000 participants. And this found additional linen layers as a risk factor for both superficial and severe pressure injuries. So this is, causing damage at all levels of the skin. Multiple pressure injury prevention programs and guidelines recommend reducing linen layers. So the pressure ulcers in the ICU patient recommendations recommend reducing the linen layers, as do the NPIAP 2019 guidelines that acknowledge the need for layers that are compatible with support surfaces. So we need the correct number and the correct type, right? And those 2019 guidelines recommend limiting the amount of linens and pads placed on the bed. And now we're working on the 2025 guidelines. So we'll have a interesting time coming up with those recommendations as well. But here we have, very clear recommendations reducing linen layers. And I'll just real briefly connect incontinence-associated dermatitis. So this is an indirect risk factor for pressure injury development. A 2016 retrospective analysis of pressure injury prevalence survey data found that additional linen layers are associated with the development of IAD, which is important anyways. I mean, we don't want our patients to suffer unnecessarily. And even if it wasn't connected to pressure injuries, this would be, I think, an important association. However, IAD does increase overall risk of pressure injury, and using additional linen layers is going to increase your IAD risk by almost 10%, so 8.3%. And this is from multiple different studies. A similar study found that was investigating one layer plastic containing underpads, which are particularly good at trapping heat and moisture, those plastic back pads, that you have reduced moisture evaporation, reduced heat dissipation, which is just a fancy way to say what I just said, right? It's good at trapping heat and moisture. But that underpad use significantly reduces the surface's ability to modulate the microclimate. So plastic backed linen layers are particularly bad to use. A lot of these interventions are looking at reducing the number of linen layers and then also switching, making sure that people are just using a single paper backed linen layer if you can. Therapeutic support surfaces are designed to best maintain skin integrity using minimal linen layers. And you also need to use it so that it's fitted appropriately. So when you're putting that linen on there, you don't want to have it too small. So you're getting that kind of like hammocking effect of the bed where it's tight and you're getting the support surface isn't going to have the correct ability to function if the linen layer isn't also correctly sized for the support surface. So in conclusion, showing you my favorite linen layer, which is Blanky from The Brave Little Toaster, which is an old movie that I actually had on Laserdisc because I'm from, the late 1900s. So excess and certain linen layers can increase the risk of pressure injury, and we've connected that with lots and lots of research today. Layers can directly increase that interface pressure between the patient and the support surface. So that's one of the ways that it's contributing to pressure injury risk. It also, those layers will reduce the therapeutic surface's ability to manage the dermal microclimate. So when we're talking about heat and moisture as well. So we're directly increasing the interface pressure. We're also affecting the heat and moisture, and all of those things are contributing to pressure injury risk. Here are my references. I like, as a translational scientist, I like everything to be evidence-based. And in this case, we have a lot of research on this, and that's why it is included in the NPIEP 2019 guidelines and other guidelines and recommendations. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you for joining.